Okay.
All right, well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're here. How many of you were not here last week? All right, well, welcome. Glad you're here. Do you have a notebook? All right, so notebooks are in the lobby. Also, pleased to announce that last week's was recorded and it is already up on our YouTube channel, Living Hope Church Athens. So if you want to check that out, we'll try to do that every week, upload the material. On the table as you came in, there is a card for our new series we've got coming up on Sunday morning starting February 18th called What If You Had Only 1 Month to Live. There's also some decals. We just had some decals made. If y'all want some decals for your car, those are out there. We may take a special offering one week to help Rich with some of his expenses traveling to and from here and just to bless his ministry. There's a table in the back with information about his ministry, right? Truth on display, so I want to make that available to you as well. So I'm going to pray, and then we are going to take some quick questions. If there's any questions from last week, I'll bring the microphone and then hand it to him as well. So we want to make sure that gets recorded well. All right, so again, thanks for being here. We're excited about the material and just what God's doing here. And this is going to be a great journey the next, I think, 7 more weeks, right? All right. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for what you've done in Rich's life. Thank you for how you reveal yourself. And I pray that every person tonight, regardless of where they're coming from in their journey in understanding you, that tonight I ask you, God, through the power of the Spirit, that you would speak and move and do what you're best at, and that is draw to yourself, because we know that you created us to have a relationship with you. And so I pray that would come through strong. Thank you for what you've done in Rich's life that he can now impart to others. And what an amazing story he has. So we just praise you for that. And God, I'm so aware that in this room there represents just a multitude of burdens that people might be carrying, journeys in life, questions, struggles. And I pray that tonight, God, in a way that only you can, through the power of the Holy Spirit, you would touch, speak, and minister to every person here in a unique way, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, any questions from last week before we dive into tonight's material? Actually, speak loud and then he'll repeat it. That'll be easier than me going back and forth with the mic. Yes.
Would you review, please, what the Calum cosmological argument for God is?
Yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument. So that's where we left off. We'll pick up again there. But basically, the Kalam cosmological argument says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe was caused as a cause. Something outside of the universe had to cause the universe. But yeah, we're going to pick up right again there, Steve. Yeah. Anyone else? Questions? Gerber.
You had said at one point that there was nothing you could say that wouldn't necessarily convince us. We have to believe and have faith first, and then we can see the truth behind things. Does that feel at all like confirmation bias to you that you had?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question just for the sake of the video. Does it feel like confirmation bias that I say that there's nothing that I can say that will prove to a person that Christianity is true? You know, the thing about confirmation bias, what I taught at the University of Georgia more than anything else was psychology. So I hear this a lot. The thing about it is, I think that you can never, no matter what your worldview is, it's impossible for a person to factor out confirmation bias and say that has nothing to do why I see things the way I see them. I think that's true for the theist, for the Christian, for the atheist, for the agnostic. You see what I'm saying? For the pantheist.
Well,
so
no embracing of a confirmation.
Right. So what I would say is, and I would go back to something I said last week. I don't see anything in the scripture that would say God is calling people or asking people to just take it all on blind faith. You can't extract out faith. Faith is going to be indispensable at some point. You know, Kierkegaard talks about the leap from faith. And so that's kind of what I was trying to conceptualize. So you have facts and evidence, you have logic. Those things comport with the Christian worldview. That's what I would maintain. But in order for a person to become a Christian, to actually put their faith in Christ, right, there's going to be an element, obviously, of faith. So, you know, like, for example, someone asked me, you know, do you have faith in your wife? And I say, yes, of course, I have faith in my wife. Well, I'm not saying I believe she exists, right? I'm saying that I trust her. And so that's what I would say. I believe that all people know on some level that God exists. Those who would deny it would be suppressing the truth for various reasons. But the fact that God exists doesn't automatically mean the person has faith in God or in Christ. And that's going to require what the Bible talks about. I think the New Testament word is like pistis or something like that. Pistis is not talking about a blind shot in the dark. It's talking about confidence based upon experience. And that's what God wants us to have in Him. Look at His track record throughout history, most specifically in the person of Jesus, and then take that leap that Kierkegaard talks about, the leap from faith. Does that answer your question? And we may disagree, but that's how I would.
To answer it further would take up too much of your time.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I did have.
Rich, Hebrews 12 talks about, or Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Okay.
I think that's one thing you have.
Right.
In other words, you said there's substance to faith in God and Christ.
Right, yes, yeah. It's not just a pipe dream, right? And so that would be the important point for me. You know, we're going to compare some of these things in tonight's lesson, so I think maybe it'll become, we'll get a chance to talk about it more. But the idea that aren't all religions kind of created equal, that from the skeptical perspective, isn't Christianity kind of tantamount to Islam, and that's tantamount to Zoroastrianism, and that's tantamount to, you know, so, and I'm going to argue against that. So I'm going to argue that not all created equal. So from that sense, you know, we can talk about one being more believable than the others, and the reasons for that. Anyone else? Okay, probably should go ahead and jump in, right? And so just to review quickly, I'm just going to spend a few seconds on these slides, throw something at me if I depart from that. We were talking about worldview. Everyone has a worldview. Biblical Christianity entails a worldview. So does atheism. It's sort of the perspective or lens that you carry with you, that you interpret or understand the world from that perspective. We said that all worldviews are not created equal. You can evaluate worldviews, and I don't submit this as a comprehensive list, but 4 tests that you can use to evaluate a worldview: logical consistency, coherency, factual adequacy, existential viability. And so in my basic argument, again, this is kind of the essence of what we're trying to accomplish with this class. Of all the possible worldviews, Christianity does the best job explaining what matters most. Okay, it's sort of the what you might call the cumulative case model, the comprehensive case model. We're going to talk about different perspectives, different angles, different arguments, and my main thesis is that when you compare Christianity to any other worldview, it does the best job explaining what matters the most. Okay. All right, we talked a good bit about scientific naturalism. That's what we're going to pick up again tonight. And now, again, just to refresh your memory, or if you weren't here last week, scientific naturalism is not absolutely identical to atheism. All right? The reason why I talk so much about scientific naturalism, which is, and by the way, I should define that again, the position that all that exists is nature. Ultimately, you have this one really big box. Everything inside of that box, okay, is nature, is natural. So whether you're talking about the Crab Nebula, okay, whether you're talking about Saturn, whether you're talking about comets, whether you're talking about Alpha Centauri or the Sun or the solar system, whether we're talking about whales or penguins or bacteria or the human brain, whether we're talking about our emotions, passions, ultimately everything distills to the material, Okay, that which is physical matter. That's the position of scientific naturalism, and I would submit that most atheists that you're likely to encounter, especially at a place like the University of Georgia, let's say, college campus, university campus, their true metaphysical position is scientific naturalism. Okay, that's what I embraced as an atheist several years ago. My philosophical stance was that materialistic scientific naturalism stance. And so again, my main contention is that scientific naturalism, there's my cat again, you know, it doesn't meet the demands placed on it. There's some glaring flaws when we adopt that as our metaphysical position. Okay, so let me skip down here. Let's get back to where we picked up, just for time's sake. The Kalam cosmological argument, that which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. Okay, so, and I like to add a couple of words. Anything that begins to exist has a cause outside of itself. That's implied in the Kalam cosmological argument. It's not self-caused, right? Something outside of that system created that system, or caused that system to begin. That's what we're getting at here. Okay, that which begins to exist has a cause outside of itself. The universe began to exist. We talked about last week, whether you're a young Earth creationist, old Earth creationist, progressive creationist, theistic evolutionist, you know, whatever. If you're anywhere, even if you're an atheist and you ascribe to what is generally regarded as the current scientific consensus, you're going to maintain that there was a time zero, a point at which space and time and matter came into existence. Okay, a lot of people refer to this as the Big Bang. I don't want to get into all the intricacies of that. I don't have a big problem if you believe in a Big Bang, just make sure you know who banged it, right? It's still a phrase from Frank Turk. Okay. So this isn't going to be a conversation about young Earth versus old Earth. That's different, great conversation, different subject for a different time. It's not required for Kalam. So my main point here is scientific naturalism fails to account for the origin of the cosmos in the beginning. So I added this slide. Two basic options. In the beginning, number one, something or someone created everything intentionally, deliberately. Something or someone gave rise to all that is. All that is in this cosmos flowed from this thing or this person or this entity. And obviously this is the theistic position, okay? Alternately, nothing created everything for no reason. Okay? Somehow, nothing gave rise to everything that exists. This is regarded as one of the biggest philosophical questions. Atheist and theist philosophers have tended to agree on this. The first and basic question of philosophy, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are there existence? You see what we're getting at here? And this is what the Kalam cosmological argument addresses or treats. Okay, so there it is again, in case you missed the blanks, but I think we're up to speed with that now. Very simple argument, and we could talk about formal philosophy. I won't go into detail, but this is, so you have two propositions, proposition 1, proposition 2, and the way they're structured here is what's called a logical syllogism. It has a valid form, so if you agree with proposition 1, if you say, okay, that's more likely to be true than false. If you agree with proposition 2, that's more likely to be true than false, then the argument proceeds. Ideally, philosophers like to say, okay, you've got to be absolutely sure about proposition 1. You've got to be absolutely sure about proposition 2. If you do a deeper reading into Kalam, there's a very powerful argument made. I've heard William Lane Craig give it, who's way brighter than I am. But the argument succeeds. You can use the Kalam cosmological argument successfully as long as each of these propositions is more likely to be true than their negation, than the opposite? Okay, is it more likely to say whatever begins to exist has a cause than whatever begins to exist doesn't have to have a cause? Okay, is it more likely to say that the universe began to exist or the universe did not begin to exist? You see what I'm getting at? And so the conclusion is that the universe had a cause outside of itself. So let's talk about some objections. You'll get this right away. That's good. That means the person's listening to you. Right? That means that he or she is wanting to engage you in a rational dialogue. So they say, okay, got a question for you, Mr. Kalam, cosmological argument user. If everything had to have a cause, then who or what caused God? Who created God? Right? It's a good question. How would you answer? Any insights? We can do some more interactive. It's a big class. I love that. But if you guys want to throw something out, that's fine. If somebody asks you that, you give them the Kalam cosmological argument.
He's eternal, uncreated.
He's eternal and uncreated. Okay, yeah, I think that's what we're going to get at here. A lot of times they'll misrepresent the Kalam cosmological argument. And they'll say, so you're saying everything has to have a cause, right? And you say, what do you say to that? So you're saying everything has to have a cause. How do you respond if you've just given them the Kalam argument? You say, no, that's not what I said. What specifically did we say? Anything that begins to exist has a cause outside of itself. So that would leave the room open for something that did not begin to exist, right? It doesn't require a cause. It doesn't have to have a cause outside of itself. Okay, so really what we're getting at here, am I too far off to the side?
No, you're perfect.
Okay. What we're getting at here, we could talk a lot about this too, but just for time's sake we won't. What theologians call God's aseity, am I saying that correctly? Aseity or aseity? His self-existence. All right? And so God doesn't depend upon anything else, any other entity for God's existence. Jesus himself says this. He's like, you guys remember this from the Gospel of John? He says, just as the Father has life in himself, so he's granted the Son to have life in himself. In fact, again, for time's sake, I won't go real deep, but even the very name that we use for Jehovah or Yahweh, think about this. God's name's not God. God gives his name for himself, and what does he call himself? I think it's Exodus 3:14, right? He shows up to Moses, and he calls himself I am. His name, God's name for himself is existence. I exist. And what this speaks to is the aseity of God, the impossibility there, starting from God's first revelation to Moses of his name for himself. What became what do they call it? The tetragrammaton, the YHWH, from which we get Yahweh, from which we get Jehovah. I am who I am that I am. I don't depend upon anything else for my existence, unlike this pantheon of Egyptian gods. I have existence in myself, right? And so this aseity really is the key to answering this objection, who or what created God? Nothing created God. Asking who created God is asking, like, what flavor is the color green? Right? In terms of logic, it's what we call a category error. Does not compute, right? It's not really a good question. Don't tell the person that, they'll be insulted, but say it in a nice way. Okay. How about this one? Objection number 2. Scientists have shown that the universe could have come from nothing. Y'all heard this one before? And a lot of times you'll get a reference to this guy. This guy who would not talk to me when I was on his campus last spring. He walked by twice. And I was bummed because I just read his book the previous summer. Lawrence Krauss, he's a kind of another prominent spokesperson for the new atheism. His book is called A Universe from Nothing. And I think he's a theoretical physicist. I may not have that right. He's either an astrophysicist or a theoretical physicist. I don't know what the difference is between those two. He's a really smart guy, and he's apparently really good at math, which I'm not. But this is not a mathematical book. So what Krauss maintains is, okay, the universe could have come from nothing. That, of course, that's the title of his book, A Universe from Nothing. And then right above that, why there is something rather than nothing. Well, okay, so here's the problem with that. When you start reading Krauss's book, you realize in very short order, he's not talking about nothing. His nothing is something. Okay? Namely, his nothing is a quantum vacuum. Now, I'm not the guy to ask, what is a quantum vacuum? What are the properties of quantum vacuum? I'm sure Dr. Krauss is far more aware of that and how quantum vacuums, if they exist, work than I am. Not important to object to this point, because the thing about quantum vacuums is they are something. A quantum vacuum has properties, right? What are the properties of nothing? Nothing. It has none. Nothing has no properties. Another way to say that is, supposing that quantum vacuums exist, right, just for the sake of argument, you would have to subtract all of the properties of a quantum vacuum from a quantum vacuum to get nothing. And so what he means by nothing, and it really is an interesting book. I don't agree with a lot of it, but it's a good read. He's a good writer. I recommend the book. Check it out if you get a chance. It's good to read both sides. But what he's saying is, what he means by nothing is just not the stuff we're familiar with, not matter that's made up of quarks and protons and neutrons and electrons and leptons and all of those subatomic particles. Something else, right, that's of a different type of continuum. And again, don't want to get too much into that. Before we go on to the next slide, I'll just leave you with a quote from Aristotle. And he defines nothing as that which rocks dream about. Okay? So if you're a rock, if rocks had dreams, they would dream about nothing. So nothing is nothing. It's not something. It's not a quantum vacuum. So if you're talking about two different types of nothing, if you're having a discussion with a person who ascribes to a theory like Krauss's, and you realize that to them, nothing means one thing, and to you it means something else, you're just going to end up talking past each other, right? And it really kind of obfuscates the dialogue. Okay. Moving on. Objection number 3. You guys heard of this one? Well, what about multiverse theory? What if there's like a bajillion universes out there? My daughter assured me that bajillion is a real number. I'm not sure how many zeros a bajillion has. But the idea with multiverse theory is that this universe that we inhabit, this space-time dimension, is just one of many, and some people say a virtually infinite number of parallel universes. Again, you could talk a lot about this. Suffice it to say, if you had to guess how much empirical scientific evidence there is for multiverse theory, any guesses? There's none. Nothing. Back to nothing. What rocks dream about, right? That's the right answer. Goose egg. This is just a theoretical abstraction. It's not, if a person's invoking it, and a lot of times people invoke what they're saying is a scientific argument, but if that's that's the perspective they're coming at. If they say, okay, this is just an idea I had, and I just believe this on faith, I don't have any evidence, to say, okay, well, that's cool. You can believe it's America, you can believe what you want to believe, but don't call it science. Don't tell me you believe this because of scientific evidence or some observable phenomenon mandates that, because that's just simply not true. Okay? And another thing, too, there is I don't see how it really gets us around the question of a creator. Let's say there were exactly 400 trillion parallel universes. Well, this sort of compounds the problem, doesn't it? I mean, now, how does that possibly eliminate the need or the requirement for a creator? It does nothing to eliminate that necessity. These are supposed to be parallel universes. It's kind of a cool picture. All right. Objection number 4. What if the oscillating universe theory is true? According to this one, they'll say, okay, well, the universe it's expanding more rapidly, space is getting bigger, things are getting further apart. And actually that's true scientifically. We have empirical evidence that backs that up. It's called redshift. But the universe is inflating, it's getting bigger. Galaxies are getting further and further apart in general. Every space itself is filling up with volume. It's called inflation. So what they'll say is, okay, extrapolating back to the beginning, the Big Bang or whatever you want to call it, well, maybe that singularity, the thing that exploded or inflated into the present cosmos, came from a big crunch. And before that happened, before the Big Bang, you had a universe that collapsed in on itself. It had been expanding, but at some point gravity took over and it started collapsing, and it all collapsed back into this infinitesimal spot, and then it reinflates into the present cosmos. And this series of events has been going on ad infinitum, okay? What if that's true? Well, again, there's a lot we could say about this, but the really big problem here is the problem of infinity, okay? And in order for that to be true, in order for something like oscillating universe theory to be true, that would mean that this, and let's say in part B, it gets us around the need for a creator. Okay, if it's true and it successfully defeats the need for an external creator, for that to be true, you'd have to have an infinite series of these inflations and collapses, inflations and collapses. The problem there is it's logically impossible to traverse an infinite series. Okay, infinity is an abstraction. It's a theoretical concept. In terms of the extended cosmos, everything we know about space and matter and physical events and temporal causality, it's impossible to get to the end of that chain, right? So that means if that were true, then prior to this cosmos, there would have to be an infinite number in the past, and that means we should have gotten here an infinite amount of time ago. Or conversely, we should never get to the point we are now. It's a self-defeating proposition. Again, people have written a lot about that mathematically. For the sake of time, I won't go into that. If you have a question about it, we can talk about it more later. I added one that's not on your sheet. It's not really an objection because, well, I guess it is an objection, but it kind of misunderstands what Kalam is trying to do. And it's really, really easy to answer. The person says, okay, the Kalam argument, how does that get us to anything? What if that just takes us to Shiva? What if that just takes us to Allah? What if that just takes us to Zeus? Or whatever you want to call it. How does that get us to Yahweh or Jehovah or Jesus Christ? And the answer is, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's not what it says it does. The Kalam cosmological argument, all it's trying to do is establish the philosophical or logical necessity for an original creator, okay? Some type of deity, some type of being outside of the system that got everything started. In fact, the Kalam cosmological argument was originally articulated, developed by an Islamic philosopher, okay? So it's not even a Christian argument. It's been co-opted into Christianity because if you're, for the point of establishing a creator, this is a great argument, but it doesn't do us any good in terms of saying, okay, specifically which one now. But it doesn't, again, it doesn't pretend to do that, so it's not a weakness. Does that make sense? Okay. I like cool pictures, so sometimes I put up extraneous pictures. This is the expansion contraction, right? The oscillating universe model. Anybody studying neuroscience in here? Taking classes in neurobiology? This also reminds me of like axons and the myelin sheathing. There's the neuroscience geek in me. All right. Number 2, okay, so we talked about the cosmological argument. Number 2, scientific naturalism. Notice my scare quotes around scientific. Those are deliberate. Scientific naturalism or naturalism fails to explain the specified and complex designs found in the created order. This is the argument from design. It's one of the arguments that's been talked about probably more than any other. In fact, I would say there's a good reason for that, because Paul appeals to it in Romans chapter 1. And he says, if you, with an open mind, open heart, right, teachable and humble, you look out into nature, you can rightfully conclude that there has to be a God. Okay, by seeing, by beholding what God has made, the creation attests to that. If you go back to Psalm 19, it's the same thing, right? Don't you love Psalm 19, the beginning of the chapter? The heavens declare the glories of God. So there's a declaration that's taking place. There's speech, but in the same phrase, there's no speech. It's a speech without speech. It's a proper inference based upon what you can see. And when you look out there, you say, wow, this isn't here just obviously as a product of random chance. Okay? And that works on both ends. Both whatever you're looking at, whether it's like a hummingbird, right? Go to Pastor David's house. They have hummingbird feeders, and they're really cool to watch, the little hummingbird wars. So it's not just the complexity of this hummingbird that's bewildering to me, but also my own brain, that I can ask the question, that I can be in awe of it, that I can comprehend it, study it, look at it. There's specified complexity on both ends. And so when we look at it, when we study nature, that becomes very evident. Okay? So I like a simple little illustration here, and it's rock stacking. Okay? This is a good way to keep it simple. If you're hiking, do you guys come across these rock stacks in your adventures? If you just happen to be walking along the creek bed and you saw this, would it be a pretty reasonable inference that an intelligent agent, that a human being stacked those rocks?
Yeah.
Like, you only have like 4 or 5 rocks, right? I mean, what is there, 1, 2, like 4 or 5 right here? But if you had to put a percent on it, what percentage certain are you that a human being stacked those rocks? Where would you put it?
About 100. Okay, so 100%.
99.9. Would anybody go under 99%? That maybe those rocks are just there? Okay, Gerb would go under 99%. I'm going to say I'm willing to place, I don't have a lot of money, but I would double down, triple down, quadruple down. What comes after that? That an intelligent human agent was responsible for stacking those rocks. Why? Because you don't find rocks arranged like that through blind physical processes. Okay? That's a simple stack. I might be able to accomplish that on a good day. What about this stack? Or these 2 stacks? Gerb, you up to 99% now with these? Okay. So we're all in agreement at least 99% with these. Yeah, and so that's what I want to compare, just for the sake of argument, is let's contrast it with a cell. Anybody take cell biology? Do you have cell biology now?
I'm a microbiologist too.
Okay.
Yeah,
So your first cell biology class, about how thick was the book?
about that thick.
About 1,500 pages?
This thick.
And that was to introduce you to...
To the eukaryotic cell and some prokaryotics.
Yeah, okay, so it's introducing us to the organelles and the enzymes and all that stuff you guys have learned and forgotten about. Transcription and genetic regulation and endoplasmic reticulum and all those fun words, right? And so what we see is that the human cell is enormously complex. Not only that, non-human cells, would you agree, are enormously complex. Atheistic microbiologists, I've looked into this, and they publish articles about origins, and these people do not believe in a creator. They believe in abiogenesis, that life comes from non-life. There was an article published either 2015 or 2016, I'd have to track down the source, where they say that the simplest cell, in terms of protocells, they believe in life from non-life billions of years ago, so what they're trying to do is say, how could that possibly have happened? And they say, well, the most simple genome, the most simple cell would require the equivalent of 140 genes, okay? You guys, you and I have like 24,000 genes. That's pretty customary for life forms today. But to get the whole system up and running, you would need about 140 genes in place, stripped down cell, very basic cell, microscopic organism, but it has to be able to regulate stuff going on inside of the cell, and it has to be able to successfully replicate itself, or it's, in the evolutionary sense, a dead end, right? And so what they say is the bare minimum that had to be there up front from the beginning, first living organisms that could replicate 140 genes. That's enormously complex. Trust me when I tell you that 140 genes in a cell is far more complex than either of these rock stacks. And that's what had to be in place. That's what had to happen the first time to get things going. Okay. That's a big... You could tell us what's going on there. Well, the reason I put that on there, I'm not going to talk about any details, but you look at this and it kind of almost looks very simple. It's like, there's maybe 15 or 20 things in there. Well, when you look at actually how the stuff the cell talks to itself and how things are regulated, you get all of these signaling transduction mechanisms which students have to memorize to make their lives miserable and then regurgitate on a test. But this gives you an idea of some of the chemical cascades that are going on that make that cell operate. That's a skinny version. There's a lot more than that. It tells you how different factors come together and how what's required to get that cell to successfully live and replicate itself and grow. Okay? This is an old book, but it has over 1,200 pages. Intro to Cell Biology. And you get a ton of information about what's going on. You know, the reason why I bring that up, well, let me go a few more slides. So sometimes, and this is on your notes, it's called the teleological argument, teleology. So you had Kalam cosmological argument, which points to a primary mover. The teleological argument is an argument that is making the case for a designer. It's the design argument. The word telos refers to purpose or a goal. And I remember when I was a non-believer and I would teach neurobiology and I would I would try to eliminate or eradicate those terms from my vocabulary when I taught. I would say it'd be really easy to say that the purpose of this adaptation is to do X, but let's not say purpose. Let's just say it's function, right? Because purpose implies, well, somebody purposed it, right? Function just means that's what it does. Okay, but the teleological argument looks for a purpose or a goal in the created order. This is a good one to use on campus. We get a lot of mileage out of this. I'm stealing it from my ministry leader, Tom Short. It's called the 5-second test. And so, I'll give you 5 seconds for someone to give me evidence for architects. 5 seconds, evidence for architects.
Buildings.
Well, ultimately your body, but the building, right. A building is evidence of an architect. Now maybe we have an architect here. Some of you guys maybe you are an architect or you know an architect. But do you have to meet an architect to know that architects exist?
No.
Assuming that none of you is an architect, do we have definitive evidence right here in front of us that architects exist? Yes, we do. What is it? Buildings. Buildings are evidence of architects. What about authors? Anybody have any evidence of an author around them? Books. Books are evidence of an author. Okay? You might not know which author, right? But the fact that you have a book points to an author. Opticians. Those are people that make glasses, by the way. Glasses, right? And the quintessential one is watchmaker, or watchmakers. What is the evidence of a watchmaker? Well, a watch is. And this takes us back to just a little historical fun fact. Okay. William Paley, Natural Theology, at some point, I want to say early in the 18th century, early to mid-1700s, And Paley has us imagine a scenario. He's a Christian, he's a theologian, a philosopher. A lot of the people back then were more than one thing, right? You had some people who were like theologians and philosophers and mathematicians and bakers, I don't know. But Paley has us imagine that we're walking along a beach and our foot hits something, and it's a solid, we reach down and you see a rock, just an awkward shaped rock. Is that evidence of a rock maker? I mean it is, but in terms of its complexity, no, nobody's going to say, oh, well, somebody had to put that there, somebody had to make this rock, so it looks specifically like this. But let's suppose instead you walk a little further, and your foot hits something else, and you reach down, and it's a pocket watch, right? And Paley's going to say, based upon the specificity and the complexity, the organization, the cooperativity of those elements being put together in that watch for a purpose, for a reason, for a telos, to tell the time, that you can properly infer that there's a watchmaker. You might, again, you don't know who it is, you don't know what he looks like or she looks like, but you can reasonably infer an intelligent mind, a deliberate, gifted, intelligent mind is behind this apparatus. It's probably the single biggest, most common argument you'll hear for a designer. So much so that our good friend Richard Dawkins, who we'll keep coming back to, how could I resist? One of his books is called The Blind Watchmaker. So he's appealing to Paley's construct, Paley's argument, the design argument, the watchmaker argument. And he says, well, don't really need a watchmaker. Don't really need, Chris, you said, well, evidence of a architect is our body. Yeah, so that type of architecture, in terms of cellular architecture, in terms of morphological architecture, you don't really need an architect. You don't really need a designer. That natural selection and evolution, and you do say evolution, by the way. I say that out of my deep-seated respect for Charles Darwin. That's how he would have said it, right? Dawkins and Darwin would have said evolution, since they're both British. So I'm not trying to say evolution is evil.
Yeah, I am.
I've gotten in the habit of doing that, sorry. But Dawkins' contention in his book is that no, even that immense complexity that we see under a microscope going on inside of a cell, that blind evolutionary forces, mutation, natural selection over eons can create the very real appearance of design and organization. Now, he starts out with that. It's like, okay, it's going to look really, 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 he doesn't say it that way, but it's going to look really, really designed. You're going to be so tempted to say, it looks like somebody made this, but he didn't. It just happened. You know, here's why. And so that's the common objection of the modern biologist. Okay, probably should move forward for time's sake. Again, just to be brief, Dawkins has been rebutted. And one of the best rebuttals to date, I think, has been a book called Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe, who's a professor of, I think, biochemistry at Lehigh University. I used to criticize his book until I read his book and I realized the people that were criticizing his argument had misrepresented his argument. Okay, it's called the straw man fallacy. And you get into this with a bunch of guys, Kenneth Miller being one of them, but okay, let me just talk about the main idea. Behe's idea is that when we look at a cell, he's a cell biologist, that there are little apparatuses in there that are irreducibly complex. That's his term. What does he mean by irreducible complexity? It means that if you took it's a structure that requires several interdependent parts, several interdependent features in order to operate effectively. And if you try to take any one of those pieces out, it no longer works. And so what atheistic evolution would have us imagine is all of this stuff by chance coming together at once to form a functional apparatus. And Behe's major contention is that can't happen, okay? And so, you know, he doesn't really get into a lot of talk specifically about God. It's his implication of his argument, clearly. But he's saying that, no, the watchmaker argument is still very much in play. It's still very valid. It's still, we could still talk about Paley. Let's talk specifically about Paley's watchmaker argument, but instead of a watch, let's talk about a cell. Let's talk about a little motor that's embedded into the phospholipid bilayer, right, the cell membrane that causes the flagellum to propel a microorganism, like a little outboard motor. And again, we could go into some of the objections to that, and if you guys have questions about that, we can go more into that, but I'm going to move forward. All right. Okay, so there is no known mechanism for mutations to both A, increase genetic information in an organism, and B, for that mutation to give rise to new adaptive advantages for that organism. So that's what evolution would require. Evolution's got to work from the ground up. It can't work from the top down. It doesn't have any sky craters, okay? To borrow a phrase from an atheist philosopher named Dan Dennett, there's no sky hooks. Everything's got to be built from the ground up somehow. And so in order for that to be true for biological life, what has to happen is that mutations, if you're, you know, heaven forbid, but if you know someone who's expecting a child and they come home from a doctor's appointment and they said, well, the doctor today said that they detected a mutation, is that usually a reason for celebration or a reason to be somber? Usually it's an alarm, right? Something's gone wrong. People don't think, well, we're going to have Superman, right? We're going to have Spider-Man. We know what mutations mean, what they spell out, and almost always they're deleterious, they're harmful. They'll result in a miscarriage or a stillborn baby or a baby who has some very major abnormality. So, but in order for evolution to work, from the ground up, you have mutation, you have natural selection. It's got to be responsible for making everything. So there has to be a mechanism that increases genetic information in our genome so that we can build a human body out of our DNA, and that for that mutation to give rise to new adaptive advantages for that organism. And they haven't found anything like that that meets both of those criteria. Okay, new information coming in. Now you will see that happening. Mutation can give you new information. For that new information to give a unique adaptive advantage prospective for that organism, there have been no examples of that. Now that's not an absolute defeater, but it is suspicious. Okay, because it means that the empirical evidence hasn't shown clearly how Darwinian mechanisms could give rise to complexity and for adaptive features of organisms. Do you guys ever get this? Like somebody says, oh, well, you're questioning Darwinian evolution. Haven't you ever heard of antibiotic resistance before? Haven't you heard of that? Well, if you believe in antibiotic resistance, then you've got to believe in Darwinian evolution. It's the same thing. To which you say, no, it's not. Right? We have no, as creationists, and again, we're not going to get into old Earth, new Earth, we have no trouble with natural selection. Natural selection, you would expect natural selection with an all-wise creator. It's not like if a minor little change happens in the environment, all the creatures are going to just die. That's not very smart for a creator, right? He's going to build a mechanism in there that there's going to be adaptation. We're not going to see these big leaps, one kind becoming a different kind. That's not borne out by the scientific evidence. So when you're talking about antibiotic resistance, you're talking about one type of corn becoming a new type of corn, or one type of fruit fly becoming a slightly different type of fruit fly. Those types of arguments that evolutionists like to make to convince us of the whole Darwinian narrative, we can affirm all of those and say, I'm okay with all of those. That has no conflict with the Bible or Christianity or a creator whatsoever. But that doesn't get us from the goo to you via the zoo type of evolution, right? Those are completely different paradigms. If somebody, again, if we have time later, we can talk about it more, or I guess next week is evolution, right? But that microevolution and macroevolution are the same thing. Don't buy it. I'll talk more about that next week. They're not. They're not the same thing. People will try to convince you that if you believe in microevolution, then you must also logically believe in macroevolution. No. And then just turn the table on them and say, well, make the case. Show me your empirical evidence, step by step, how this has happened. You claim to believe this on the basis of science, so go ahead and make your case. Right? Some suggested readings here before we move on. Okay, Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer, really good book about how DNA is such powerful and persuasive evidence for intelligent design. The middle book, again, check it out. I certainly have some major disagreements with Francis Collins. He's a theistic evolutionist. He's a Christian. I'm not doubting his faith, right? We worship the same God through the same Savior. That's great. Francis Collins he headed up the Human Genome Project back in the early 2000s, when they successfully sequenced the entire genome for human beings. He was the head of that project. I think he, until recently, was the head of the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Is he still? Okay, so very brilliant man, follower of Christ, believes. And the title of his book is The Language of God. He's a geneticist. He's talking about the genetic code, how that's inexplicable apart from a creator. DNA is not like a language. DNA is a language. So that's the major thesis that Collins develops in his book. We would disagree about dates and ages of rocks and stuff like that, but his major contention I'm fully on board with. This is very clear evidence of a creator. And then another really good one, maybe we'll talk about it more next week, is, in fact we will, I've already started working on the lesson, Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells. And so what Wells does, if you're going to pick one of those, go with Icons of Evolution, start there. It's a really good book. He looks at things like Darwin's finches, right? The Haeckel's embryos. We'll talk about that next week. But all of these things that people try to advance. The peppered moths. Are you guys familiar with the peppered moths? The Industrial Revolution in London. And these moths went from being white to being darker because they were better camouflaged as darker. Well, what he does is he systematically rebuts each one of those icons of evolution and shows us how it doesn't actually prove what it's supposed to prove. All right. I like pictures of babies. This isn't one of mine. I have a hard time getting and I always did, even when I called myself an atheist, to look at a picture like that and say, okay, this is really what we're looking at here is stardust that's been rearranged by blind physical laws over billions of years. You know, I mean, it just doesn't quite resonate, does it? All right, number 5, scientific naturalism fails to provide grounding for moral absolutes. Are we going in sequence? Is that? Yeah. Good. Okay. So naturalism fails to provide grounding for moral absolutes. It's another big failure. This is called the moral argument for God. If you guys have heard of C.S. Lewis, I hope you have. If you haven't, check him out. If you want to start with the book Mere Christianity. Highly recommended, no matter what your beliefs are. C.S. Lewis was an atheist. He didn't like Christianity. He rejected Christianity. He was a professor at, I think it was Oxford. Was it Oxford or Cambridge? Oxford, okay. Of medieval literature. And through meeting with some theists, namely J.R.R. Tolkien was a very big influence on him, especially in terms of his conversion to Christianity. But he comes to realize on his own, independently, that there has to be a God, and his major argument for God is what's called the moral argument for God. That at least some objective moral truths exist. Not all morality, not all right and wrong, not all good and bad is purely subjective. There are some things that are really wrong, really bad, really awful, really evil. Doesn't matter what society or culture you live in, where you grew up. Okay, if you're a free moral agent, you choose to do this, it's really a bad thing, and we can talk about it categorically and absolutely as being bad. Or conversely, something that's really good, something that's really morally good. Okay. Now, his argument's not going to say that we agree on everything. Obviously, there's some significant cultural differences about things like dress, music, social interactions, how far away you stand, greetings, things like that. And what's offensive in one culture might be perfectly acceptable or even expected in another one. That's not the argument that all morals are absolute. It's saying that there's at least one. That's all that's required, literally. Honestly, that's all that's required to successfully make the moral argument, is that there's one thing that is really, really bad to do or really, truly good to do. Either direction, one thing that's going to indicate that there's a transcendent moral lawgiver that had to be behind it. Okay, and so what I'm going to argue is that that's true, and that scientific naturalism can't back up that claim. Okay. The quote I have there at the bottom, "Without God, everything is permitted," by Dostoevsky. Right? And so the picture there is piles of bodies outside of one of the Nazi concentration camps, the emaciated corpses. You know, you guys have seen the pictures before. Or we're from the South, you know, a topic that has just a ton of gravity that causes us to feel rightfully nauseated when we look at the history of racism in the South. When we look at the pictures of the lynchings, bodies hanging from trees, and you recoil from it, and you're disgusted, and you don't want to have dinner now. Well, that's good. That means that but see, what it does is it points to the fact that there are moral behaviors that are really right and really wrong. And the atheist is in a real pickle when they try to deny that. Okay? Scientific naturalism fails to provide grounding for morals absolutes. And so I have a quote here from Book 1 of Mere Christianity. This is right where Mere Christianity picks up, right from the very beginning. Lewis calls it the law of human nature. So Lewis's law of human nature corresponds to our agreed upon notions of ought and ought not, or should and should not. Okay? Theism, Christianity, supports real shoulds and real should nots, real oughts and real ought nots. Atheistic naturalism really doesn't. What we're going to see is that in the final analysis on naturalism, all you can talk about is preferences. You know, Holocaust, not really my thing, but, you know, Hitler, he kind of liked it, so I like chocolate ice cream, he likes strawberry, I guess. Just a matter of opinion. You know, and our argument is no, these things are not matters of mere opinion. Holocausts are really wrong, racism is really wrong, lynchings are really wrong, rape is really wrong. Think about the ubiquity of campaigns that go on for moral awareness. Right? The more recent ones that are in our media environment today, the Me Too campaign. Well, is sexual assault really wrong? I talk to a lot of atheists who, and I'm not getting political at all, I promise you, I'm not a very political person, but I have no desire to talk about politics. But they'll say, well, wow, what an awful person that is. He did this, and I'm like, okay, yeah, if he did those things, you're right, you're absolutely right. But in the same breath, the next breath, they tell me they're an atheist, and right? It's like, well, how do you live that out consistently? You know, all you're saying is, well, you wouldn't sexually assault someone. That's not what makes you click. But hey, if it's just brain fizz in your head and just brain fizz in somebody else's head, how can you say that their phys is wrong and yours is right? It's just phys at the end of the day. You're both just stardust. You're both just here as an endless result of mutations and selection events. It's kind of hard to really say that the rapist is truly wrong, but we know they are, right? We know they are. Okay, come back to that later. However, in an atheistic universe, there should be no ought. There should be no should, right? That's easy to remember. There should be no should. There should only be is. All you have is what is. Material, physics, atoms, electrons, getting moved around by physical laws. That's all you've got. Okay. So, I mean, basically the mantra there, it is what it is. So let's try that on again. It is what it is. And I'm not trying to be gratuitous. I understand that the pictures I'm going to show you, you know, there's moral gravity there, and there should be. But who would look at that? My question is, who would look at that, though, and with a straight face say, well, you know, it is what it is. Go take a tour of Dachau. And it's funny what that does to people. I've never been, but I've heard stories of people that just, you know, they lose it. Because, and they're not expecting to. They know it's going to be grim, they know it's going to be melancholic, but they're not prepared for what they actually get hit with while they're in there taking the tour. But this one, you know, abuse of women is what it is. I don't like it, but, you know, it's something that happens. It's like a boulder rolling down a cliff. What can you really do? It doesn't work, does it? It doesn't fit. A few months ago, Charlottesville, did you hear anybody on the media saying this? Oh, well, you know, I wouldn't drive my Dodge Charger into a crowd of people and run them over and kill them because of different ideological alliances, but, is what it is. Rape. Have you guys seen these signs? These are popping up. I saw the first one out in Austin, Texas last spring, which is probably no coincidence. This says a lot, and I mean, obviously we could, the subject matter is, again, not to get political, but this is really common with secular progressives. Has anybody seen this before anywhere, like on t-shirts or in yards? In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, okay? Women's rights are human rights. I'm good with that. No human is illegal. I mean, if we talk about, it's, again, different topic for different times. Science is real. I'm not really sure what I hear this a lot, and I'm not really sure what they mean by that. I think it's some sort of statement about climate change being settled science. Again, different topic for a different time. But science is real. Love is love. Obviously a gesture about LGBTQ type discussions. Kindness is everything. Well, my objective is not to critique any of that per se. There's a lot of that I would agree with. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But here's my thing, like, if there is no real morality, do Black lives really matter? I think they do, but how does the atheist consistently maintain that position? Women's rights are human rights. I agree, but how does the atheist insist that that must be the case, and any departures from that are truly bad or evil or deplorable or reprehensible, whatever term you want to use, right? So again, just kind of stated here syllogistically, the moral argument for God. This is a different logical syllogism, but it also has a logical form. It's called denying the consequent, by the way, in case you're wanting to know. But again, two propositions in a conclusion that follows absolutely if the propositions are more likely to be true than not true. Number one, if God does not exist, then objective morals do not exist. If God does not exist, then objective morals do not exist. Number two, objective morals do, in fact, exist. At least one. Okay? Take your pick. If you think that torturing babies with blowtorches for fun is morally neutral, then I try to use an extreme example on purpose, but then maybe I'd have a hard time convincing you. But I think most of the sane people in the world would say, no, it's really a bad thing to do. Torturing babies for fun. You know, you see a baby in the alley that's starving and shivering and cold. You could either pick it up, wrap a blanket around it, and give it a bottle, or you can cut it and pour salt in its wounds. You know, again, extreme example, I know, but for the purpose of the argument. And those are morally neutral, you know. I don't know anybody who would maintain that. Thankfully, my atheist friends and I agree that there's right and there's wrong in that situation. And because they want to do the right thing and I want to do the right thing, we agree. And the argument's not, can atheists do good things or are they bad? That's not the argument. The argument is there real good? Is there real evil? Okay? Objective morals do exist, therefore God exists. Okay, what about this objection? I like putting these objections in here because I hear them all the time. This is probably the single one I get the most. I can't believe you're saying that atheists can't be good without God. There's whole campaigns in the atheist community. We're good without God. Right? And to which I say, I'm bad with God. Read Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 18. There's none that does good. There's none righteous. No, not one. They've all turned away. Their feet are quick to shed innocent blood. There's no fear of God before their eyes. That's not just the atheists. That's all of us, okay? So I would say, no, we're bad. But I understand sanctification happens and all that, but different topic. But I think what they're trying to say is, you know, atheists can do good things without needing to believe in a God. They can feed hungry people without needing to believe in God. They can help homeless people without needing to believe in God in order to do that. To which I say, yeah, you're right. You know, and a lot of my atheist friends do those things. And that's good that they do those things. They're doing good action. They're doing a good deed. And I'm thankful for that. And thank God that the atheists are doing good things too. But the argument's not about can atheists do good things. It's can there be real good? Can there exist real good and real evil without God? A moral anchor. Okay, you see the difference? So, kind of like the main objection you hear is really, I don't know what you'd call it, a red herring. It's off topic. Okay? That's a book from presumably a secular humanist. Oh, look at there at the bottom. A humanist chaplain at Harvard University. That's interesting, isn't it? Objection number 2. Morality is socially constructed. You guys heard of this one before? If not, go hang out on a college campus for a while and talk to some people. It won't be long before, if you start talking about morals, somebody will say that almost verbatim. Well, you know, morality is just a social construct. Right? What may be right for a certain person, a specific culture, may be wrong somewhere else for a different person. I'll do about 10 more minutes and then we'll do Q&A. Does that sound good? Okay. Any claim that truth is socially constructed commits philosophical suicide. It's self-defeating. It's self-refuting. I think if you think about it for a minute, you'll understand why. And this is not a complex argument. Right? Somebody's telling you that truth is socially constructed, and we're talking about moral truth here, but more generally or more broadly, that truth is socially constructed. That's the one I usually hear. Don't you know that people have different truths? Truth is socially constructed, to which I say, where did you learn that? And they say, well, I'm a philosophy major. Oh, so you're a philosophy professor and your philosophy books? Yeah. Well, I mean, that belief you have was socially constructed by them. Right? They pretend to be this like outside observer looking at the system and making these judgments, but no, you have beliefs too. You're susceptible to social construction. You're susceptible to social influence. You're not immune from that as a human being. There's no such thing as an unbiased human being. It's literally impossible. There are no Dr. Spocks in the world, okay? People who are just pure information processing machines. There is no such creature. So any claim that truth is socially constructed commits philosophical suicide. It contradicts itself and therefore cannot possibly be valid. Note further that the objector's logic would provide for at least the potential for things like the Holocaust, things like rape, racism, lynchings. At least conceivably, they might say, well, I would never do that. And they'll start appealing to their culture. But what they're saying there is that there's a conceivable situation where those things would be permissible. They might not come out and say it, but that's what they're implying, right? The alternative is, no, rape is really wrong, but then you've got to deal with that. I agree with you 100%. Let's talk about how we get to that point without a God. How we get to that point if all we are mutated and adapted beings, stardust, okay? Objection number 3. You've probably heard of this before in one form or another, but maybe you don't know the formal title. It's called Euthyphro's Dilemma. It's from Plato. If you want to remember the sequence, spa. Like you go to the spa, right? Socrates, S, P, Plato, A, Aristotle, right? Spa, so you'll never get it wrong again. So Plato, in talking about moral good and moral bad, the question comes about God. We'll say, well, is the morally good only good because God commands it? I think he said the gods rather than God, but it's the same argument. Is that which is morally good only good because God commands it? Or does God command the morally good because it is truly good? Do you see the dilemma that this gets at? Okay, with the first half of that, if it's the case that God only commands certain things willy-nilly, it's called divine command theory. It's like he woke up one morning and flipped a coin and said, tails, adultery's bad. But it could have come out the opposite way, and God would be commanding us all to commit adultery. That's not true, by the way. This is what I'm saying. It's called divine command theory. So, is that which is good or bad only good or bad because God commands it sort of arbitrarily, sort of capriciously? Or does God command the good because it is truly good? If that second part is true, it would seem to suggest there's a system higher than God, right? God is beholden to some system that transcends even him, and he says, well, no, adultery is wrong because, it truly is morally wrong, so I better tell these people I've made to not do it. And so this is called Euthyphro's Dilemma. You see the point where it seems like these are going, like you got to pick one or the other. So what's the solution to this? Anybody happen to know? Megan?
It's God's character to be good and to have those qualities.
Right, yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's God's character to have those qualities. It's part of his nature. And so what we would say is Euthyphro's Dilemma is what's called a false dichotomy. You heard of that before? False dichotomy. A person's trying to say, you got to pick this or you got to pick that. It's got to be one way or the other. Well, no, there's a third possibility that actually resolves the apparent dilemma. And it's exactly what Megan said. God commands the good not because it is good, but because what? Because he is good. You see the difference? Because goodness is his nature. Truthfulness is his nature. God didn't flip a coin and say, I want everybody to be honest. Could have gone the other way. No, God is not a deceiver. He's always going to shoot straight with you. He's not going to try to pull the wool over your eyes. And because that's his nature, he commands us to be like that. Because we could go deeper with that theologically, but God knows that that's where real life is found. In being like him, right? In that aspect. Okay? So Euthyphro's dilemma is a false dilemma. God commands the good because, not because it is good. He's not beholden to a transcendent system, but because he is good. All right, let's do 2 more minutes and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. Number 4, I did get those out of sequence. I had 5 earlier, now I'm at 4. We'll just keep plowing forward, okay? Scientific naturalism fails to provide any basis for purpose and meaning in life. Again, this quote from Dawkins, I don't know if we did it earlier, we'll probably hear it again during the course of the class, but the universe we observe, says Dawkins, has precisely the properties we would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Right? This is what Dawkins says. This is what Shakespeare has to say in Macbeth. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Life, it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I don't think Shakespeare was an atheist. I'm pretty sure he was a Christian, but the character apparently is some type of non-deist, and it taps into that. If we're not here for any reason, any purpose, then he's absolutely right. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And then probably stop here, but on atheistic naturalism, we are ultimately all mere stardust. You're from stars, you were cooked up in a nuclear reactor, the stuff that makes up your body billions of years ago. You're going to live for 50, 60, 70, 80. If you're really lucky, you young people, you might make it to 110. But in the grand cosmic scheme, what difference does it make? You're going to die, you're going to rot, you're going to go back to the ground. Eventually the sun is going to engulf the earth, burn everything here up. And in the words of C.S. Lewis, ultimately, from that worldview, it's going to be nothing, not even a story. Okay? You've heard of the word nihilism before? We'll talk a little bit about that next week. And I'm going to maintain that a person who's being philosophically consistent with atheism or with naturalism, it's inescapable. Nihilism's inescapable. For most, think about life. Most young people's lives, you're talking about health and virility and having fun and being absent from major aches and pains. It kind of peaks around 25 or so, doesn't it? 30. I can attest to this now. Once you get into 40, 45, heading into 50, it's kind of like you realize, wow, I probably am never going to feel as good as I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Why don't we all just give up? You know what I mean? If we're just stardust. If our anticipated pains, if our anticipated labors and pains and illnesses and those sorts of things are bound to outweigh any pleasure we could possibly derive from life, well, just do the math. Why isn't everyone jumping off the bridge? I'm glad nobody's jumping off the bridge. None of you guys jump off the bridge. Okay, because I think that worldview's false. But my question to the philosophically consistent naturalist or atheist is, well, why not? You know, why not? Especially after you get to a certain age. All right, well, we'll stop there for tonight. I'm behind. It's probably going to take me next week to get through these notes. This is the first run for the class, so I don't know always how long things are going to take. But,
You can go past 8 weeks if you're going past 8 weeks, but we'll see.
okay, yeah. So we'll finish the philosophical stuff next week. And
Do you think you might introduce evolution next week or not?
possibly, yeah.
Okay.
All right, do a few questions. Did you want to take the microphone out there?
No, you can just repeat the question. Come on, get some doozies tonight. Stump the professor.
All right.
So when looking at Euthyphro's dilemma, if you say that God is good, what do you do then when you're faced with something that you can say in the Old Testament that does not appear good? What does that mean? Because that would seem to me to push more to the idea that God is commanding good and whatever he says is good.
Yeah, so the question, again, I'm just going to repeat it for the sake of the video. We're saying that God is good, so when we look at certain vignettes from the Old Testament where it seems like something specific, kind of like he commands killing. Is that a good one?
That could.
Right,
We can find something.
Yeah, the Amalekites. There were times where Israel's commanded, go in and wipe out the Amalekites, put them all to death. Right? How do we maintain God's goodness amid that? And so what I would say is God's goodness doesn't always look like our goodness. We have to look at the broader theological context. Okay, so when we're looking, there's a book called Is God a Moral Monster by a guy named Paul Copan, which I think does a great job at exploring this idea. But there are a lot of things we read about in the Old Testament that are like, wow, I don't understand that. I don't understand how in the world is God commanding the Israelites to kill. The short answer, we could go into it more in a later week, is that God is using Israel to judge these nations. Okay? God's goodness and his judgment are not at odds with each other. Right? In fact, I would argue the opposite. I would argue if God is truly good, if there is true good and true evil, true right and true wrong, and a person or people have really deliberately and repeatedly chosen to do that which is evil, then God's judgment is not only an option, it's a guarantee. It's absolutely required in order for God to be a truly good judge, to be a truly righteous judge. In other words, all sin, theologically, all sin must be judged. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. So each one of us right now, every single person in here deserves death. If we died and God sent us to hell, we would be getting nothing more, nothing less than what we absolutely deserved. I know that's true for me. You know, it was one of the turning points in my heart. And so we're used to experiencing God's grace and mercy, you know. And of course, Jesus tells us to love our enemies as Christians. That's true. We're not God. We're not supposed to come in and get our own vengeance. The Bible says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But what you're seeing there in the Old Testament, I would argue, is sort of like God, in a sense, is parting the curtain a little bit, and he's giving us a glimpse at what divine judgment looks like and how awful and horrible it can be. But it's good. It truly is good because it's going to uphold God's perfect moral character. Another thing, just real quick about that, if you don't mind, is one of the things you'll notice when that would be a big problem for me still. And I'm not saying it's an easy question to answer. It's a great question. But if you're familiar with the Old Testament, which group of people gets judged the most in the Old Testament? The Israelites, by far. Yeah. And so kind of to me, the charge that, well, the Old Testament is like what Richard Dawkins says. It's filicidal, genocidal, and it's really just, and the explanation you'll get from so many Bible critics is that, well, this book came to be as the result. It was a nationalistic sort of a weapon of genocide, that Yahweh was just their god of war that they gave allegiances to because he would help them go in and wipe out people and take their land. There's really no way you can read the Old Testament and walk away with that not severely challenged, because Israel's the one that gets judged more than the Amalekites, more than help me out, there are some other groups there, or just the Canaanites in general, right? Pluralistic group. And so, but see, what we're seeing, even when Israel is judged, we're seeing God's goodness. We're seeing God's goodness on display during the Babylonian captivity, during the Assyrian captivity. Why is God judging them? Well, they're his people, but also he's a good God. And they've sinned. And they can't really say, well, we don't deserve this. Right? Does that kind of make sense? Did you want to follow up at all?
Well, we talked, it flows into one of the other things about moral relativism and objective morality. Would you say that killing babies is objectively morally bad?
For a person to take it on their own human initiative to kill a baby, yes, would be objectively morally bad.
To kill a baby, you know. So,
right, yeah.
God did that to Egypt.
Yeah, God is, he's the author of life, and he reserves the right. It's his divine prerogative to give life and to take it away. And he's never going to do that unjustly.
Well, just as outside the question, does that make him killing babies a morally good action?
His judgment of the sin of the Egyptian is a morally good action. That falls under the overarching theme of God's omnibenevolence. Entailed within his omnibenevolence is the requirement that he judges sin. Again, all sin must be judged. So we could pick and choose and say, well, and I agree that's a hard one to get our minds around. Here he's judging the firstborn of the Egyptians. Really, it's a judgment on their parents, though, if you think about it, more than it is the babies. But it is a judgment. But in the same way, I think the whole theological context is we're seeing God's judgment and his wrath being poured out on Egypt in that series of 10 plagues. And we're seeing his grace and mercy being extended to the Israelites who are freed from captivity and led out into the promised land. But what we're supposed to see now in 2017, when we go back to those stories, is both aspects of it. And ultimately they converge at the cross. Because what we see at the cross is we see God's, sometimes we'll ask this when I do public evangelism, I'll ask people to think about where in the Bible would you say that is the clearest picture of God's unrestricted, unrelenting wrath and his crushing of a person or people? And I think the answer is the cross. The cross is the only
An innocent man.
the only time a truly innocent person has ever died. And he died in the most horrible sense. And so to me, when we look at the cross, we see the justice of God. You see the goodness of God. You see the mercy of God. You see the love of God. You see it all coming together. The picture that we have in the foyer of the building, it's justice and love. Are those the two?
Justice and mercy kissed at the cross.
Justice and mercy coming together and kissing at the cross. I mean, because God's alternatives. If the Bible says the wages of sin is death, and then God says, okay, well, but here's sin, and I'm not going to require death, then God's not being a good God. He's gone back on his word. He's compromised. He's capricious. It looks more like, this is not a jab at Islam, but it kind of looks more like Allah than it does Jehovah or Yahweh. But the cross insists that he punishes all sin. The cross insists that the wages of sin is death for every single person. The wages of my sin is death, eternal death, spiritual death, right? It's just, I don't have to suffer that because Christ suffered it on my behalf. And so to me, the point of the stories is for us to get in the Old Testament, is to get what we should take away from that is how seriously God considers sin. And we see that repeatedly. We see, again, throughout the Old Testament, we see it more commonly with Israel than we do even with the Amalekites and Canaanites. In the New Testament, you see it in the New Testament church, right? And Ananias and Sapphira, they tell what we would say, that's not that big of a lie. They gave a lot of money, but they were dishonest, and they fell dead, and they dragged them out and buried them. And so what God gives us is we get used to his mercy, we get used to his grace. We're supposed to live as people where that characterizes our behavior. But God doesn't want us to lose sight of what a huge deal sin is to him and how his justice requires that the sin be punished. Okay.
It's an awesome place to end. Man, Rich, thank you so much. This was so rich. It was rich. So Rich is with a ministry called Truth on Display, and talk about what's on that back table, and then I'll pray us out.
Yeah, I have some small books and then a slightly larger book. The small book, both books are from my ministry leader, Tom Short. I have a book that I've written that we're somewhere in the process of getting it printed, but it's going to take probably another couple months. We carry these with us around the campus. The little book is called 5 Crucial Questions. It's just 5 questions that come up again and again and again on a college campus about Christianity. What does Christianity claim? What's it all about? Big picture type stuff. It's written on a pretty basic level. Feel free to take one of the 5 questions books. We give out hundreds, if not thousands of those every semester. We have plenty. The other book, if you really are interested in knowing a lot more about our ministry, and maybe even considering partnering with me and Tom, feel free to take one of those. I have more. It's called Taking It to Their Turf. And the idea of that book is Tom has put together, I think it's 60 or 70 some vignettes, little stories that are a page or two long each, from being out on campus for the last 40 years, having conversations about the gospel and answering questions and interacting with all kinds of people. So that's what's in that. The best part of the Taking It to Their Turf book, it's all really good. The best part is the foreword. I think it's, just a little bit better than the rest of the book.
It's really
I read the